So interestingly enough, in Australia, the standards organisation is actually independent of government. It's a commercial entity. And it works better because it has the same user pays model, but obviously you've got 5 to 6 times the number of users. So the maths works a lot better. But even in Australia, they are struggling with the model.
Kia ora, I'm Troy, here as Chief Executive, and welcome to Stirring the Pot. Thanks for connecting. If you're new, here's what you can expect. We're going to be talking the tough stuff, the things that keep us middle minds up at night. There are many challenges facing our industry and equally many opinions on how we should tackle them. Stirring the Pot provides a facilitated forum to discuss and challenge these viewpoints.
So let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. Today, we're having a kōrero with Dr. Richard Templer, Chief Executive of Engineering New Zealand, about the systems behind our standards and what it'll take.
Richard, can you tell us what standards are and why they matter for safety, innovation and everyday life in New Zealand?
So standards are a way of effectively codifying best practice. So if you have something, say, like a timber design standard, it's a document which sets out the best way to do timber design. And why standards are very helpful is they essentially provide a shortcut. So if you're designing a timber building, you can go to the standard, look up the best way to do it, and simply scale that design up or down to meet your needs. It adds a lot of efficiency, and it also results in much safer designs because the standards process has been tested. And in our regulatory system, when we're looking at things like building consents, if you design to a standard and you can show what standard you've used and that you've complied with it, it's basically automatically accepted by the consent authority. So they're a really important part of doing things. And they're across everything: food, software, building structures, medical devices. There are standards for pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of how standards are developed in New Zealand, can you run us through that process and why that process needs reform?
So the way the standards process works is if someone identifies the need for a new standard or for an existing standard to be refreshed, they have to approach Standards New Zealand about getting that done. And it's quite an expensive process. It typically costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that money has to be found. Now, in some cases, the government owns the standard, so the government will find the money. But in many cases, the standards are effectively owned by industry. So industry groups get together and chip in the money to fund the standards process. So that essentially means you have to get a group of extremely knowledgeable people, in our space typically engineers or scientists or specialists or whatever, get together and work through what should be done in the standard. So if you're looking at a design standard, they've got to sit down as a group and say, okay, for this design, what is the best way of doing it and how do we codify in the standard? And that can take a long time, often years, because in addition to going through that discussion, everybody's got to agree. And so you may have people who are manufacturers, you may have people who are designers, you may have people who are quality inspectors, and getting them all to agree on what are the right way of doing things takes a lot of time. Once the standard has been agreed, Standards New Zealand then codifies it into a standard and then makes it available. The challenge is we have a user pays model, so you then have to buy the standard. And this is the part of the model in New Zealand that is falling down. So you'll get the situation where engineers have spent a whole lot of time and money developing a standard, and then they have to pay for the outcome. And because a user pays model basically relies on a large number of people buying the standard, in the New Zealand market it's just too small. We don't have enough users. And so what happens is the price for standards goes up because the number of users are small, and so less and less people are actually using the standards, especially the new ones. they're typically using old standards or they're trying to find standards somewhere else.
And so what are some of the real impacts of that lack of accessibility of the standards?
So what it results in is basically people not using them or using old standards. So an example, one of the things that is regularly updated and is in the process of being updated again is fire standards for fire safety in buildings. And when I worked in local government, one of the examples we saw is where a construction company had built a reasonably significant building, and they'd built it to an old standard. So they'd followed the old standard and they'd got everything right. But the new standard, which they hadn't purchased and kind of possibly weren't aware of, or maybe it was too expensive for them, required different things. So basically, during the building process, they had to retrofit a whole lot of different things to make the building comply with the new fire standard. And that was very expensive for them, it was frustrating for them, it was frustrating for council. So if standards are readily and easily available and people can get the information they need, things like that are avoided.
Mm-hmm. And at HERA we know firsthand that there's a need to continuously update standards. And as you mentioned, that's a really costly process. But as research evolves, there are really good reasons why standards need to be maintained and updated. Do you think that especially for those that are referenced in the code or may be referenced in the code in future, that's really a public good contribution, and therefore maybe a public funding model needs to exist? What are your views there?
So absolutely. So this is one of the things Engineering New Zealand has been pushing strongly for. So where there is a direct reference to a standard in, say, the Building Act or the Building Code, it is normally made freely available by MB, and that's greatly appreciated. And that is typically funded from levy funding, so building levy. What we have suggested is using the building levy to help fund the whole standards process, so the development process, but also broadening the range of standards it covers, and also looking at some of the other levies the government has to actually make more standards freely available. Because from a whole economy point of view, the use of modern standards actually saves the economy a lot of money and results in better outcomes. So in some places, Singapore, for example, all standards are freely available because the government's just directly funded it and said this is a public good activity. Yes, there is a certain amount of private benefit, but that private benefit is massively outweighed by the public benefit of people using standards. So that we're not going to get there, but we would like to see much greater use of government funds to support the standards process and deliver new and updated standards.
And that's definitely HERA's view as well. We're continually frustrated because we use our own research levy to fund our research, and often that's informing the development of new standards or the revision of standards. And then we also provide FTE onto the committees. We're often also funding not only the development costs for New Zealand, but the ASNZS fee. And then at the end, we still have to pay for the actual copy of the standard. So it seems wrong. It seems very flawed and unsustainable.
It's the triple whammy. You're paying for the development, you're paying for people's time, and then you have to pay a whole lot of money for the standard. And more frustrating is that for the standard to be used, you need all the commercial players to buy it as well. So,
yep.
Yeah.
And what's happening in Australia? How do they manage this process over there? And is it any better? Can we learn anything?
So I think there's quite a lot we can quite a lot we can learn from the Australian standards approach. So interestingly enough, in Australia, the standards organisation is actually independent of government. It's a commercial entity. And it works better because it has the same user pays model, but obviously you've got 5 to 6 times the number of users. So the maths works a lot better. But even in Australia, they are struggling with the model. I was fortunate enough to meet with the people from Standards Australia earlier this year, and one of the things they're doing is an end-to-end review of their process, and I've actually been involved in that review. And one of the drivers behind that is they recognise there's this significant public good, and so they're basically essentially building a case for government to say, listen, this is what the standards system currently looks like. If we are going to make standards more available, if we're going to get more people to use them, we're going to have to change the model. Because the idea of people buying large PDFs or paper copies of standards and having them stacked on desks and flipping through them, that's not how modern designers work or modern users. They're going to want to use software tools to basically give them the standards information answers. And in order to do that, that's going to cost a significant amount of money, but it's a direct public good. So they're engaged in a conversation with government about the importance of standards and government support.
We were recently investigating the use of AI for design, verification and compliance. And one of the thoughts we had was, wouldn't it be great if we could have like a real-time standards development process where it's kind of like a peer review process on the integrity of the science, but actually you can have a digital process and the use of AI to real-time incorporate new findings from research. Because we find, the lag between we find something in research that might, for example, meet the requirements of quality and safety, but reduce the requirements of the tonnages of steel and therefore have, a cost and environmental benefit. But it takes about 3 years to get that actually into a standard and then more broadly applied. And no one will use that until it's in a standard because there's too much risk associated. So what do you think are the opportunities for a more digital and forward-looking process for the development of standards?
I think there's huge opportunities in this space. An example I'm aware of is master plumbers. If you're a member of Master Plumbers, you have access to the plumbing standards in New Zealand, and I think there's about 14 of those. And so Master Plumbers created an AI agent, so basically a enclosed AI, and they fed that AI agent those 14 standards. And then they asked it a whole series of questions about plumbing applications. And what they found was that the AI got it basically exactly right in more than 96% of the time. And their view is that would be better than all but the most experienced plumbers, and undoubtedly better than someone sitting there with a stack of 14 standards trying to find the answer. But most importantly, if you think about a plumber at work, they're not going to sit there with 14 books in their toolbox. What they will have is a cell phone. And in this case, you literally had an AI agent where you could just talk to it and ask the question. So you can imagine someone, maybe a junior plumber partway in through installing a bathroom, and they're trying to work out what distance should the U-bend be for this diameter pipe and this volume. So they literally ask that question, and then the agent would say, right, you need 250 mil drop. So a brilliant example of using new technology. But here's the kicker. On the 1st of July, Standards New Zealand increased their prices for all standards by 12.5%. They had to because demand had gone down, user pays, so the prices have to go up. But they also updated their terms and conditions. One of the things they said is you cannot put any of our standards into any sort of AI device. So Master Plumbers and Standards New Zealand are having quite a discussion around that. Now, essentially it's a breach of copyright thing, and I understand them doing that. The problem is that it's incredibly easy for people to do that because the standards are available at PDFs, and you can literally just someone will chuck those in. What we've seen when people do standards queries using things like ChatGPT is, as you know, with ChatGPT, it always has an answer, but it won't necessarily draw from a New Zealand standard. It might draw from an American one, an Australian one, or a European one, and that's part of the problem in this space.
Yep.
So I think technology, fantastic opportunity to better enable the standards process, to make it faster, to make it more accurate, to make it incorporate new research findings, and just make it so much more accessible. But we've got to have a new model for that to work.
I think, wouldn't it be great if it was Standards New Zealand who was actually looking at the potential for use of AI to help the users to implement standards, rather than, the industry associations having to do it and then finding that they, a barrier is created to prevent it from happening.
Yeah, we're spent a lot of time talking with Standards New Zealand, and they're actually a really good bunch of people, and they are trying their best, but it's the constraints they're under. Like many parts of government, they've literally had to downsize because of reduced funding. So you've got less people trying to run the system than there were previously, and they have previously identified the importance of AI. But when you've got both a people squeeze and a financial squeeze, it becomes very hard to do things like that. I know they would love to. I know they would love to change things. And we've talked to the Honourable Scott Simpson, who's the Minister for Standards, and we're hoping to talk to him again in the future about this, because it needs some sort of rethinking. One of the other challenges is you buy standards as an individual thing, and let's say you're in a steel construction firm. There are a certain number of standards you'll need, but every now and then you'll have something you go, well, I might need a standard for this. My personal view is, if I look at the way things are going, probably a better model would be a subscription model, which would be, if you're an engineering design consultancy, you'd say, we would like access to all the standards that exist in these fields, and we're willing to pay X amount a month, rather than buying individual standards. Because I talk to people and they're like, I need to get a standard for something, and it's a bit hard to tell from the title whether or not that's the right one. So there have been occasions where I've bought a standard and gone, it doesn't give me what I need to buy another one. Where a subscription model, I think, would deliver a much better outcome.
Mm-hmm. So looking forward, what would your vision be for a fit-for-purpose standards process for New Zealand, say by 2030?
I think it would be one where there was more government funding supporting the base activity. It would be one where digital tools have been enabled to enable a much faster process. It's one where standards would be delivered by digital tools, whether that's AI or I think probably AI agents is the best way to go. But fundamentally, the economic model is fit for purpose, and that means you'll always need to have a certain element of user pays. But I do think a subscription model or something like that, something that makes it easier for people to belong and use and that sort of thing. If you take the barriers away. So case in point, I used to work in local government, and so local government, when someone cites a standard, it is very useful to be able to use that standard to check they've been using it properly and they've got the right results. But if you haven't got that standard on the shelf, you then have to go and specifically buy it. Now, if as local government, you could basically buy a subscription to New Zealand Standards Library and it cost you X amount per month, that'd be fantastic, because then when someone used a somewhat obscure standard, so classic example would be things like snow loading. In quite a few parts of New Zealand, you won't often see someone looking at snow loading. So you won't necessarily have the relevant part of the standard at hand. So you'd just go into your subscription, or even better, an AI, and go, I have a warehouse with this span, I need to know what the standard is for snow loading. And just ask the question like that, get the answer, and you'd be like, sweet, that's just saved me hours of work. I'm happy to pay whatever it is for that monthly subscription.
Mm-hmm. And there is also quite a bit of money left over in the building levy fund, so there could be a strategic allocation there as well. Any final views around the standards process that you want to leave listeners with?
I think it's important to note that it's not just in the sort of engineering space. This is a wider issue. So we put a letter to Minister Simpson about this, and we had more than 30 organisations support us on that. And they reflected a very wide range, not just engineering organisations, but all sorts of manufacturers, people who service providers and business owners, because everyone recognises that the current system isn't working. So we need to find a solution. We're going to keep talking to government about it and seeing what we can do to gently prod them in the right direction.
So there you go. Thanks for joining our conversation with Richard today. If you'd like to connect more with him, you'll find his details in the show notes. When the system that defines quality can't sustain itself, something has to change. Food for thought till we see you next time. So hit subscribe, and if you liked what you heard today, please like, review or share with any metal minds you know. Let's spread the word.